did want to let everyone know that while the meeting's only scheduled till noon Eastern Standard Time, I will be keeping the line open if if topics come up or discussions wanted to be continued after the meeting, feel free to stay on and continue those discussions after 12. All right, so first thing on the agenda is introductions. So since I'm already talking, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Allie Miles and I work for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. And since I'm starting, is there anyone else from Indiana on the call?
This is Grace Bassett from the Indiana Department of Health.
Hi, Grace. All right, is there anyone from Illinois on the call?
I am Megan Bowers from IDPH.
All right, Michigan?
This is Lisa Fisher with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
And this is Carolyn Cook, also at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Good morning.
Morning. Anyone else from Michigan?
Oh yeah, sorry, this is Brandon Armstrong with Eagle.
All right, New York?
Wayne Richter with the Department of Environmental Conservation.
Jesse Becker with the Department of Environmental Conservation.
Tony Forty with the New York State Department of Health.
Kristen Dieterle with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation.
And Reese Bleetoff with the New York State Department of Health.
Colleen Parker, New York State Department of Health.
Alana Jarris with the New York State Department of Health.
Melissa Stone with the New York State Department of Health.
Katrin Williams, DEC. Wow,
Jay
New York.
Jay Wilkins, St. Regis Mohawk Tribe Environment Division.
All right, anyone else from New York? Ohio.
Mariah Hood, Ohio EPA.
John Estenek, Ohio EPA.
Jared Burson, Ohio EPA.
Rebecca Fugate, Ohio Department of Health.
Mridula Gupta, Ohio Department of Health.
Anne Gregg, Ohio Department of Health.
All right, Ontario.
Satyendra Balsar, Ontario Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks.
Pennsylvania.
Tom Barron with Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection.
Heather Smiles with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission.
Anyone from EPA?
Hi, this is Derek Ager from Great Lakes National Program Office.
And anyone from Glyphwick or any other organizations I missed?
Wisconsin?
Oh, sorry, Wisconsin. Wisconsin?
Hey, this is John
Sean
Myman, the Department of Health Services.
Sean Strom, Wisconsin DNR.
And Henry Anderson, University of Wisconsin.
And Pat McCann is on the line, formerly from Minnesota, retired. And I think Jill's on the line too.
I am. Good morning, everybody.
Gosh, I'm slacking already. Minnesota, I missed you too. Anyone else from Minnesota?
just the states west of the Mississippi. Huh?
All right. Well, next on the agenda is remembering an old friend and colleague, Jackie Fisher. And when I say old, I certainly don't mean that she was old because she passed away far too young. But Jill was nice enough to make a slideshow. So let's try to pull that up real quick. All right, can everyone see?
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
Yep.
And for some reason, Teams today is a little different format for me, so I don't know how to play it. It's not really giving me an option. So I will go ahead and scroll through the photos. But I just wanted to open it up, open up the floor, I guess, to anyone who would like to share a story or a memory of Jackie.
So this is Wayne. I'll just start. I'm not good at stories. My wife remembers things about my life that I don't remember, but I just remember Jackie as an incredibly warm person and very welcoming and just always such a pleasure to interact with and just really wanting to help in all kinds of ways. And I learned a great deal from her. Particularly about how to navigate the complexities of EPA and Glencoe. Always found her very supportive and definitely miss her.
Hi, Satyendra from Ontario. I echo sentiments expressed by Wayne. Want to add that she was extremely passionate about protecting and improving our environment. We had very good discussions on variety of topics. I always noticed that she was one of the most active participants in the consortium meetings. She would provide like meaningful contributions so that we could move forward, and having that kind of connection with US EPA was a good asset for the consortium, and it's a big loss for our group as well as individually for me to lose such a caring and passionate colleague. I was in disbelief. I'm still in disbelief. As you can see from the picture, she was quite young, and this speaks for itself that life is so fragile, and we all should be grateful for whatever we have, and try to contribute our best to the world we can. So thank you.
I would just echo all of that as well and just add a few personal notes. There was one thing Jackie liked, and that was a beer along with Pat. So here's a picture of us out to eat as well. And that was always a good time to learn more about personal activities and what was going on at EPA as well. And she really kept the consortium of all the activities she had. This was one of those that she really kept on top of and really helped out and helped with prodding us to remember to apply and gave us ideas to do. And I was amazed at, for somebody who had a fairly significant chronic health condition, how she managed her health and worked from home and always was there. She never missed a meeting that we had or a telephone call, even though we know that at times she struggled with her health condition. So she certainly will be missed, and was one of the founding, if you want to say, individuals or fathers of the consortium, she really was there and helped shepherd us through and stayed in it from the start to the finish.
Yeah, I agree, Henry. And this is Tony 40. You rarely meet people that are so lively and engaged and so much want to do a good job. And, being the position she was in to help us, and she just helped all the states so much that really, I think that, things with the Great Lakes states in terms of advisories and even cleanups there's been great achievements. And it's people like her, and particularly people like her, that made that happen. And oh yeah, we are going to miss her so much, Thanks.
And this is Henry Spletoff. I don't know if I knew Jackie as well as some of you, but I always appreciated her. I think I met her first at the Chicago Consortium meeting, and that was her home turf, I think. And she was just so friendly and welcoming, and sat down with me a couple times and tried to encourage New York to apply for GLRI grants, and she was just really warm and friendly presence, and I really appreciated that.
And I'll echo that. I only met Jackie, at several handful of meetings, but I did notice that she always loved to smile and laugh. And if you were in the same room with her, she wanted to know you, and she wanted to know about your kids and your life. And she wanted to figure out a way that she could give you money and help your state. And so I definitely appreciated that. And not only give you money, but help you through the process. If you were new to a sort of a grant or the process, she would really take the time to walk you through it and explain things and just help you get everything done that needed to be done. So she was a huge advocate of the consortium, and she will be greatly missed. All right, so I guess we will move to the next item on the agenda, which I think is jumping into state presentations. Unless, was there anyone else? I didn't want to cut anyone off.
This is Pat. I just want to echo what everyone said, that Jackie was such a warm person and that she will really be missed. And she really made it possible for us to get together and network and have those beers. So she's really going to be missed.
And I think talking about her and going through this process is also, it also brings to light the importance of in-person meetings, in my opinion, because, talking on the phone with someone or hearing their voice isn't quite the same as spending 4 days with them once a year and going out to dinner and having those beers. So I guess that just, I don't know, sends another reason for hopefully in the future getting back to in-person meetings so that we can make those personal connections with each other. I just wanted one more time, if everyone could mute themselves. I hear some background noise. Okay, but moving on to the next agenda item. I think Ontario is up first for giving their state update. And I'm going to try to unshare this. I did not have success on sharing earlier, but I will try again.
Thanks, Sally. I guess meanwhile I'll turn on my camera for just a brief period because I don't want to clog my bandwidth as well as everyone else. So just want to introduce myself. So Satyendra Bhavsar, I'm from Ontario Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. I'm research scientist with the ministry and lead our fish contaminant monitoring program. So I'll be providing a quick update, our annual update. just want to highlight the importance of meeting in person for sure. Like I definitely miss those meetings. It gives us opportunity to connect with each other, and also like create that team environment that we have been really enjoying. At least for me, I can say that over a decade and a half, this has been wonderful collaboration on various fronts, especially for someone like a province like Ontario, where we share waters with all of yous, and or mostly all of yous, and having that connection helps us not just improving our program but contributing to all the work we do collectively and science that we use for our programs. So well, luckily, at least in these challenging times, we have now tools like this type of video calls and online meetings, where we can at least continue to share our thoughts and findings. So I'm not complaining a lot, but at the same time, I do miss those in-person meetings, and let's hope that in near future we'll be able to do that again. So with that, I'll share my screen now. Hopefully that will stop, Ellie.
Yeah,
your
it worked
sharing.
before.
Okay. Can everyone see the title slide of my brief update?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So I know we have a few new members as well. So I'll okay, just okay. So what I will do today is provide a quick background of our monitoring program and kind of annual update on our recent activities. So if you are not aware, and again, because we have some new members joining over the past year or two, just so very briefly, Government of Ontario started monitoring contaminants in Ontario fish during late 1960s. Some of you may remember that there were some mercury-related issues going on at that time worldwide. There were new research papers coming out about contaminants that we would find in fish. So the monitoring activity started in late 1960s, but program was officially established in 1976 so that all the activities that we were conducting within the province could be coordinated. Just a quick primer on the province itself. It's one province, and I know Great Lakes water resources are shared with 8 Great Lakes states. If you combine the area, the land and water area of 8 states, it's pretty similar to what we would find for province of Ontario. At the same time, population of Ontario is about 7 times smaller, and economy is about an order of magnitude smaller. So we have a vast area to cover with relatively much less resources. Also, if you look at the most of the northern part of Ontario, so this part, that's the 87% of the area of the province, but 94% of the population of Ontario is in southern Ontario. So if we want to cover the northern part, specifically for fish contaminant monitoring, because there are many locations very popular for fishing, flying locations and lodges, we have extra challenges to go through because of this kind of imbalanced population density. We publish our fish consumption advisories through Guide to Eating Ontario Fish. This publication has been going on since 1977. We used to do annual update until 93, and then it switched to biennial update. The online interactive presentation started in 2011. Last update was released in June 2020. What you can see from all the red dots, we have over 2,500 water bodies and locations in our advisories. And the Great Lakes waters within the Ontario jurisdictions have been divided in about 60 smaller regions. And you can see those smaller region boundaries in the maps. And we have like a kind of a separate areas for areas of concern. Many of our monitoring data have been used in variety of scientific publications as well. Just over the last 10 years or so, we have published over 50 papers. So those publications have helped us in understanding what are the long-term trends for various contaminants, as well as understanding some of the science behind those contaminants. So now moving on to providing a quick update, annual update. Our next update to fish consumption advisories is planned for the coming year. As I said, typically it has been biennial. So last update was in June 2020. So now the next one is planned for 2022. In future, we are working towards updating more frequently now that, it's not just relying on paper publications, which was, of course, a different requirement and based, but online updates could be much frequent. So we are working towards that. You can find our advisories at ontario.ca/fish guide. We continue contributing towards assessments of fish consumption beneficial use impairment for Great Lakes areas of concerns within the Canadian boundary. Recently, we have created a 5-year plan to address the requirements for this type of BOI assessments at various AOCs. And on basis of that, as following the plan, like we have been conducting fish consumption surveys at almost all the Canadian AOCs so that we can actually appropriately define what is the beneficial use for each individual AOC. Because that can help us in understanding if that beneficial use is impaired or not. So for example, let's say at, AOC XYZ, if people are eating only walleye and pike, and if, and they are eating only, let's say, twice a week, so 8 times a month, if the advisories are meeting those needs, then that particular beneficial use is not impaired. So that can help, the surveys can help. So we are conducting AOC specific surveys. Last year we collected samples from 7 areas of concerns and conducting chemical analysis on them. And BUI assessments are underway for 3 areas of concern. So our program, heavily contributes to this monitoring needs. We have been partnering with academic researchers on microplastics in fish. As most of you are aware, it's kind of emerging topic. I wouldn't say emerging concern yet, but there are some concerns that whether fish are safe to eat from microplastics or not. In one of these projects that we recently finished, and you can see that has been published in ESNT, we looked at microplastics and microparticles in general in gut, fillet, and livers of 7 species from Lake Simcoe, Ontario. So it's an inland lake, but it's a fairly large lake, similar to Lake St. Clair. There are some urban areas around that, as well as First Nations communities. Our findings suggested that larger fish typically have higher microplastic load compared to smaller fish. However, smaller fish generally had more translocated particles. So like, transfer from gut to the fillet part and so on. However, there was no biomagnification observed. So because there was no significant relationship between the trophic level in total as well as translocated microparticles per individual. We also noticed that shapes and materials of different types of particles varied among tissues, suggesting that, those characteristics, so whether they are round shape or fragments and so on, or fibers, that can, dictate where they would end up in fish body. In general, microplastics are translocating, so it looks like they are moving into other organs, including fillet, but excretion of these particles or growth dilution might be occurring, and that's why we are not observing bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Now, one thing is, these are some of the preliminary findings. We are trying to understand, what's the importance of air deposition while processing this fish and all that, because in general, our exposure to microplastics and microfibers through air inhalation is generally greater. So I don't think consuming fish is a major source for microplastics. Similarly, on microcystins or harmful algal blooms related toxins, we conducted some experiments in our lab where adult and juvenile rainbow trout were exposed for 96 hours to both intracellular and extracellular microcystins. So, in algal bloom cells, the toxins are inside, but then, it gets ruptured and it gets outside in a free form. So there are differences in their fate and impacts. So we collected samples at 24-hour intervals, and what we found that rainbow trout did accumulate both intracellular and extracellular microcystins. However, when it's in extracellular form, so in more like dissolved form, we do see greater accumulation. We did conduct proteomics and histopathology analysis, which revealed that both type of exposure does create some sublethal toxicity in fish. So there is a potential risk to fish populations from harmful algal toxins. Then we also looked at microcystins in fish from Lake St. Clair, and we are also working in analyzing samples from Lake Erie, which I'll update at some point in future. For Lake St. Clair, we analyzed total 124 samples of 7 types of fish. So on graph, you can see each individual type on x-axis, and y-axis shows the total microcystin concentration. We have drafted some preliminary advisory benchmarks. So for this one, you can see, I think it's 6. The line has kind of shifted a bit. So in general, what we are seeing that, oh, by the way, the samples were collected in 2016 and 2018. So 2016 samples were post-bloom period and 2018 were pre-bloom period. And we did analyze for some samples both fillet and livers. So for livers, we found highly variable concentrations of microcystins from very low, like 1 nanogram per gram, to very high at 1500 nanogram per gram. So this level shows that the fish were exposed to microcystins, because we did find in liver. But in fillet, levels were pretty low, non-detect to about 15 nanogram per gram. So when we compare with our advisory benchmark, you can see from the graph that most of the values were below even the first advisory benchmark, where we switch advisory from 32 to 16 mils a month. So overall, there is very low risk from fish consumption from microcystins. And so this is total microcystin, not just microcystin LR. So it also gives us a little more conservative scenario, and still the risk seems to be pretty low. But more work is definitely needed in this field.
Hey, Satyendra, sorry to interrupt. I'm just giving you the 1-minute warning.
Okay, thanks. Our colleagues from Wisconsin issued some warning for rainbow smelt due to elevated PFAS levels from Lake Superior. So we have conducted some more work on that. First monitoring was done in 2013 for Eastern Lake Erie. The levels were in 60 nanogram per gram, which is similar to what Wisconsin found, but PCB advisories were more restrictive. Recently, we have conducted more samples from various locations throughout our Great Lakes waters. You can see those red circles on the map. Our findings indicated that for most cases, the levels were within the range of 16 to 32 mils a month. But in North Channel, the levels were a little bit elevated, comparable to those eastern basin of Lake Ontario, as well as what Wisconsin found for Lake Superior. But in general, the levels were still much lower. Just want to highlight that our advisory benchmarks are under review. They are less stringent than what Wisconsin used. But they are under review right now, and if they change and become more stringent, then advisories would be different from what we are seeing on this graph. So we are working towards that. And I know it's a kind of last. I just want to make a note here that I didn't present much on mercury PCBs and other organochlorine pesticides, dioxinferons, and so on, those type of monitoring, but those are our regular monitoring. As a program, we collect samples from about 200 locations a year. We monitor about 6,000 to 10,000 fish a year. So a lot of regular data do get generated through our regular monitoring. So with that, I'll stop, and if there is time left, then I'll try to answer questions, if any. Thank you.
Thank you. I think so. On the agenda, we are saving all questions for the end of kind of this session of state updates. So if anyone has a question or comment, feel free to put it in the chat or just jot it down. And so after all of our presentations, we'll address all the questions. So next up is Ohio.
Hi, this is Mariah Medu, and do you mind if I go first with a quick little Ohio EPA update?
No, please do.
Okay. Well, give me one moment. I'll share my screen. Everybody see that?
Yep, we can see it.
I'll turn on my camera for just a second. Like Satchandram's conserving bandwidth, but hi everybody. I'm Mariah Hood. I'm with the Ohio EPA. I'll turn that off. And I've been with the program for 3 years now, so I finally feel like I have enough experience under the belt to understand what's really going on with the program. But our update is going to be nice, short, and sweet, because as with everybody else, 2020 was a weird year and it really cascaded throughout. But one of our first things is that we actually have some staff changes. We now have Jared Burson as our field fish tissue coordinator. Previously, that was Ben Rich. He's now manager over the field crews. Ohio EPA hired a lot of people 30 to 35 years ago, and so we're currently going through a wave of retirements. So we're seeing a lot of staff changes, and this is one of them. Jared was an intern through fish collection, so has been very familiar, and it was an easy transition for us to have him come on as the field fish tissue coordinator. So as I said, 2020 was a weird year for everybody. Our sampling was really hamstringed because we didn't actually get out into the field to start doing any biological or chemical sampling until July of 2020. And we typically rely on hiring quite a bit of college interns. We weren't able to do that. So we had to rely on internal staff to make fewer teams of people to do those fish collections. ODNR, so Ohio Department of Natural Resources, is responsible for our inland reservoirs in Lake Erie. They were able to still do their sampling as usual, but our sampling of the rivers and streams was definitely greatly reduced. The other compounding factor here was that our lab had distancing protocols in place as well, and definitely slowed down sample receiving time and the turnaround time for these samples. As such, the updates we had for 2021 based on the 2020 data wasn't much. There were no changes to Lake Erie advisories, but we did have changes to 5 reservoirs and 1 river, which is the Sandusky, leading into the Lake Erie Basin. Generally, good news. We had mostly advisories that were reduced or were less restrictive than our statewide general advisory of 1 week. Sandusky River was a little bit of a mixed bag. We had some advisories that became more restrictive, but we also had ones that improved. For this season, we just wrapped up fish tissue sampling. We still had the COVID modified protocol, but because we had a whole year to get this in place, we were able to hire interns and have our full season. We're still expecting to have some slight delays in the lab, but to get most of that data by February and be back on track for having our regularly scheduled sampling. And that's it for me. I'll hand it over to ODH, who has more comprehensive and frankly exciting updates for Ohio.
Let me share my screen first. Sorry, can you see my screen?
I can, Madhu.
I didn't want to see like that, but give me a couple of minutes. Should have fixed it before. Does this look okay?
I don't think it's in the presentation mode.
Okay.
But it's okay. I mean, we can see your slides. We can just see what's coming.
Okay. I don't know why it doesn't show me here. Slideshow.
Maybe I wouldn't worry about it. I would just go ahead.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, it looks good. I can read it.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Mridula Gupta from Ohio Department of Health, Bureau of Environmental Health and Radiation Protection. Actually, I'm fairly new to this program. I just started a year ago. And I work as an environmental specialist, working with Fish Consumption Advisory Program and also on Legionella. Today, we are giving an update on 2 of our GLRI grants. I'll be giving an update on one of those, and Greg will be presenting on the second one. The one I'm talking about is the grant we received from GLRI for Ohio Fish Consumption Advisory Educational and Outreach Expansion. The project was funded for 1 year from 2020 to December of this year. But since with the COVID, there were a lot of things which we planned didn't occur, and hence we are requesting an extension till end of next year. The main goal of this project was to improve the public awareness and understanding of the fish consumption advisories through expanded outreach. So for this project, we broke down into 3 objectives. The first one was to identify a target population. We broke down our target population into 5 distinct populations. The first one was pregnant and nursing women, because pregnant and nursing women are very sensitive to the nutrition values of fish. So that's what we chose, those as a separate group. A second was the general population, to include everybody in this group. The third was licensed anglers, and ethnic and new Americans, that included refugees and immigrants, and finally economically disadvantaged populations. After we identified all our target populations, we wanted to see if we could identify the best and effective outreach strategies. And to do so, we conducted several meetings with the stakeholders, get their inputs from the stakeholders through surveys and questionnaires. And finally, after these, getting the inputs from our stakeholders, we wanted to develop the fish consumption advisory materials and the ways to disseminate this information, either through brochures or pamphlets, or through translation of the materials. As of now, the project, we have completed a part of the project. Actually, most of the groundwork for this project has been done, but many of the in-person events which were planned did not occur in 2021, and we are planning to do so next year. So the first one was we convened stakeholders to identify our collaborators. We had several set of meetings with several of our state agencies, Ohio EPA, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, and several other organizations, Lake Erie Commission, Ohio Sea Grant, and so forth. The meetings helped us to identify all the target populations, and that's how we identify our 5 major target groups. In the due process, we have distributed the fish consumption advisory materials to a lot of our stakeholders, that included food banks, metro parks, soil and water conservation districts, libraries, local health districts, and so forth. We have also identified social agencies to work with the ethnic and minority communities. I'm giving a little more description on what we have done so far for each of our target group. So for the pregnant and nursing women, we met with the week counselors through online with a meeting, and then we sent them week questionnaires. This week questionnaires was developed with various input from the stakeholders. We sent out these questionnaires to all of the 84 week counselors in Ohio. 80 of the surveys are completed, so over 95% of the response rate. The survey assessed the knowledge and the need of FIS congestion advisory information, the frequency and depth of information shared by the week counselors to the week clients, and we also tried to understand what would be the best outreach method to disseminate FIS consumption, along with the challenges faced by the week counselors in setting or giving out these messages and getting their inputs on what would be the best way to educate the week clients. The feedbacks again received will be used to develop a week specific toolkit. And I'll show you the snapshot of our questionnaires we sent. It was a short survey, keeping in mind for everyone to complete. So the first one was, do we discuss the FIS congestion health benefits and risk with the week clients? And if it was from never to always, if they thought it was important for the week clients to understand FIS congestion advisories. And do you think it is important for the week clients to eat healthy quantities of fish? In order to understand what was the challenges, potential challenges to the week counselors to convey the message, we asked them several and let them know if they can select all of those. So like time constraints, clients' lack of interest, language barrier, and things like that. And we also asked them if we could provide, or what we could provide them to facilitate this fish congestion discussion with the week clients. So that included like trifold brochures, posters, wallet cards, online web pages, videos, PowerPoint slides, talking points and fact sheets. And also asked for any other comments or suggestions they might have. Just to know where these informations were needed more, we also wanted to see which county they were working on. We already have received the results of this survey, and we are working on aggregating this data and trying to see what specific toolkits we would need to develop for the week counselors. For the target group for the licensed anglers, ODNR, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, sends out a routine survey every year to all of the licensed anglers through email survey. So what we did was we developed a questionnaires, a suite 6 question survey, and appended these questions to the ODNR survey. The survey is actually going out in from January this year. It was supposed to go in fall, but it's going in January and will be sent out to 500 anglers for 6 months. So the questions included, before taking this survey, were you aware that fish congestion advisories are issued for a certain fish species caught from some water bodies in Ohio? And if they, based upon the answers, if they answered yes or no, the following questions were there. So, but we were mainly focusing on identifying what would be the best way for them to obtain the informations. So like question number 5, would informational web pages be helpful, or the fish congestion advisory printed booklets or social media? So we will see, once we get the results of this survey, we should be able to target our target this group through the media they have identified. And again, it was the same thing. If would you like to get, for the question 6, would you prefer to get information on FCAs? Sorry, I think it was maybe this was sorry, number 5 and number 6 are pretty much same. I don't know why I may have put the wrong survey there. For the general populations, and we target our general population through our regular fish congestion advisory program as well, and this was included in for this grant work as well. So for this process, we distributed our fish congestion materials to many of the various organizations that included food banks, lake irrigation offices, soil and water conservation districts, to the county offices in ODJFH, to Lake Erie Swimming Inc., to the ordinary offices. A lot of the brochures went to local health districts, brochures and ballot cards to many of the libraries and outdoor recreational retailers like Cabela's, and also to clean marinas. So these are the numbers of brochures we sent this year to all of these organizations. Along with that, we posted our fish conservation advisory pamphlets and information on our ODH websites and also on the ODNR hunting app. In the future, we are planning to attend in-person community events and gatherings. And for those events and gatherings, we are creating display boards and posters. And we are also planning to do some targeted social media campaign with our partner single channel agencies for this general population. Just to give a snapshot of what we have been doing through the social media for the general population, we sent out these media messages. Something like, did you know that some fish in Ohio should be catch and release only due to contamination like mercury and PCBs? And those were posted on Facebook and Twitter. And these are the stats of how many people were raised through in July through September of this year. Another target group was new Americans. We define new Americans as any immigrant and refugees populations or person from other countries who are settled in here. One of the major group of these would be Spanish-speaking people, and without identifying any target group for this, we translated our fish conservation brochures into Spanish languages, and now these Spanish materials will be distributed to the migrant labor camps in spring of next year. We are, in addition to Spanish-speaking people, we know there are several other immigrant and refugees population in Ohio, and to outreach those communities, we are trying to find local social agencies. Through our internet research and talks with our previous organizations and stakeholders, we have found some organizations, some community organizations who work with these immigrant and refugees population. And we are in the process of finalizing one of the agencies. So once this agency is finalized, they will be working with the various immigrant population. This agency, the one we have been looking does have an established connection to multiple ethnic organizations, and they have established connections with them. These organizations educate and provide information on various aspects of settling in the U.S. actually, and also they plan to include the fish conservation advisory in their cultural orientation program. In addition to these, the social agency would be doing at least 2 outreach events per community, and they will be sending out social media public awareness campaigns through their local trusted partners. In addition to that, we would like to translate at least in 6 different languages for our fish conservation advisory materials. In Ohio, we have a big community, like a Nepali-speaking community, Ukrainian and Burmese populations. So, and we are in the process of identifying what other languages would be needed to translate. And the local agency which we will work will be able to identify those and translate those materials for us. We cannot thank enough for our stakeholders. Some of them are listed here, not all. So this is the pretty much update from the first GLRA grant. And for the second one, actually, Anne will be presenting. And do you want to run your presentation by yourself, or I can move?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me unshare my screen. Okay.
Let's see. see if I can get it to work right here.
And just to let you know, we're at the 5-minute mark right now, but we are a little ahead of schedule. So
Oh, okay.
wanted to give you an update.
Okay. All right. So you're seeing my main screen and it's in slideshow, right?
Correct.
Okay. Fantastic. So my name's Ann Gregg. I'm the toxicologist in the Bureau of Environmental Health and Radiation Protection. Been with you all probably about 3 years now. I guess I just wanted to say, Ohio wouldn't be doing both of these grants if it wasn't for Jackie. She was a proponent from the beginning, and she worked through a lot of the scope and the issues that, that kind of make all this, work and how we're getting through everything. So I definitely wanted to put that shout out for her, given our meeting today. So our second grant is focused on cyanotoxins in fish tissue in Ohio. We are looking at a 2-year season here. So we're doing sampling this season and then next season, and then we'll be pulling together all of the results. So we're looking at exposure to cyanotoxins through the consumption of sport fish as a public health concern. I think a lot of us know that Lake Erie has harmful algal blooms every year. They are mainly focused on the Western Basin, and more recently, in more recent years, it has extended into the Central Basin. And this has been an annual occurrence. It's something that we expect every year. It's something we plan for and monitor very closely with the blooms that happen. The exposure routes of these toxins of humans and animals are via drinking water and obviously recreating on the water. And then taking that to the next step is eating the fish that's caught from the water. It's still fairly new science. I'm really excited to read the paper out of Ontario that you put out. The little is known is about the prevalence and the bioaccumulation of cyanotoxins in fish, and ultimately that makes that risk unknown. So it's still being investigated quite a bit. The program in Ohio, just to kind of give you a little bit more background and for the newer people, is interagency group. So we've got Ohio Department of Health, Ohio EPA, and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. So between the three of us, all the steps happen, right? The fish collection, the fish analysis, and then the data analysis, and then obviously the public outreach part. A lot of the approach that we take is for the traditional fish analysis for the long-term contaminants, the mercury, PCBs, and whatnot. The toxins are present. They basically, so what toxins are present that might need an advisory? Basically, when we're looking at the cyanotoxins, there needs to be a different approach. So the connection between the traditional fish analysis with persistent contaminants is not the same approach that we need to be able to take if we need to do advisories or health messaging for fish tissue. And so that's kind of where we're headed with this, with our major outcomes here. So we'd like to evaluate the feasibility and the need to develop protocols for cyanotoxins in fish tissue. And then we want to issue that information and figure out what the best way to issue that information would be. So what we've done is kind of devise a sampling. We're going to collect data. So Ohio Department of Natural Resources is doing a lot of the sampling for us. Basically, there's the 2 bloom seasons. Like I said, I know I'm trying to go faster too. I'm sorry. We're looking at Lake Erie, and then we're looking at an inland lake called Grand Lake St. Mary's. So the collection of composite fish, and then we're also doing concurrent water samples at the same time. And then what we'll be doing is analyzing those samples for multiple freshwater cyanotoxins. So just to kind of give you a sense here, this is Lake Erie, and obviously Grand Lake St. Mary's is here. It's basically on the border of what's considered the basin. So it's kind of its own system here. It's a man-made lake, and it's very shallow, and it's kind of separate from everything. So it's a scenario where it's kind of a controlled situation where there isn't much going in and out, and it's very shallow, and it's a great kind of worst case scenario when it comes to microcystin because they are constantly covered in blooms. Lake Erie is another situation here, right, where we've got blooms in the western basin and some in the eastern or central basin, basically because Ohio is nice and flat here, and we have a lot of the nutrient runoff into the most shallow part of Lake Erie. So with the sampling locations, we're going to be doing, they'll do trawling and gill netting in both the western and the central basins. They've got this broken up into 3 sections for when they do this. So ODNR will be going out and collecting those samples. With the Grand Lake St. Mary's, they're going to be doing electrofishing along the coast, along the shoreline. If you think about Great Lake St. Mary's, it's very shallow. It's only about 5 to 7 feet deep. And it's basically about the same depth all the way across. And so it's very warm, it's very contained, and it's always in bloom. So it's a great site to collect. So the sample collection, there's going to be a total of 94 fish composite samples. They'll be frozen immediately, and there'll be the concurrent water samples frozen immediately, and then there'll be field connection or field conditions documented.
No, I'm on a conference.
So with the sample collection, we're looking at a lot of different species. This is a lot of basically part of the Ohio DNR, Ohio Department of Natural Resources approach. And so we are keeping with their approach and how they composite and following the normal sampling procedures that Ohio does when we composite samples and how we measure and congregate and collect those samples. Analytical methods, we're relying on a lot of the mass spectrometry as much as possible. The Saxon toxin is the only one we'll be doing with ELISA. What's really interesting, I think, that has also been a question out in science is the total microcystin versus the different congeners. So we'll be doing a first pass with all of the samples for a total microcystin using the MMPB method, and then breaking it down if there is a positive detection. We'll look for the 14 individual congeners that the lab we're using is able to identify. So as far as the status goes, we have our QAP approved. We've collected in Grand Lake St. Mary's. The Lake Erie samples, I believe, are being sampled or finishing up right now. And we're going to begin researching the various guidances and toxicity values, some of the new research that's out there, and contract with the lab and move forward with receiving our results for this sampling season and then preparing for next season. So this is our contact information. If you'd like to get a hold of us, or Midhu and myself, we're on the list, obviously, for the consortium, so you can reach us through that. And that's what I've got.
All right, thank you. Again, if anyone has questions, jot them down or put them in the chat, and we will address those after New York's presentation. All right, so I'm next to give the Indiana update. So let me share my screen. Jill, when you time me, feel free to interrupt to give me the 1-minute warning. All right, can everyone see? And I'm sorry, this is the wrong version. Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm Allie Miles with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and I'm going to give you a brief update on what's going on in Indiana. Well, last year at our annual meeting, I was the sole representative from Indiana due to staff turnover and retirements. So this year, I'm happy to announce that positions have been filled and our Indiana Interagency Work Group that works on the fish consumption advisories is now fully staffed. And this work group has been collaborating since the 1970s. To introduce everyone, myself and Tim Fields we represent the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and it's our role to collect the actual tissue samples and have them analyzed and then manage the database. And Grace Bassett is our representative from the Indiana Department of Health, who's also on the call today. And she leads the way in outreach and education, as well as managing the advisory webpage. And then Dan Carnahan represents the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, and he assists us in collecting samples, including those from Lake Michigan. And he plays a role in getting advisory information to the public through the Indiana Annual Fishing Guide, and also partners with the Health Department on outreach events. So hopefully, as in-person meetings resume, you'll all have the chance to meet everyone I just introduced. So moving on, nothing new. I'm going to present on Grace and I are going to present on our GLRI grant at the third meeting, but today I kind of wanted to talk to you about the pesticides in Indiana fish tissue. Last year, Illinois gave a great presentation on their pesticide data, and it's something that I've wanted to do in Indiana for quite a while now. So let's jump right in. So we've been collecting data, organochlorine pesticide data in Indiana since the 1980s. We analyzed several dozen parameters, and generally we just target those that bioaccumulate. So to jump right in, let's look at DDT. So what this map is showing you is that based on the FDA action level, not a single sample since the 1980s was above that FDA action level. And for us, the FDA action level kind of represents the 1 meal per month is how we would treat that. So in 40 years, we did not have a single sample above that FDA action level. And then here's just another way to look at it. You can kind of see down here in the table, over time, you can see how those average concentrations have decreased. Again, never having a concentration above that FDA action level. Here's another way to just look at it so you can see that definitive trend line. So total chloridane, we use the white paper that Tom Hornshaw developed with the Consortium. And on the map on the left represents all of our 1980s data. And you can see we had a handful of 1 meal per weeks, a few 1 meal per month. And then as you look at our 90s data, you can see the concentrations decrease. Again, the 2000s and then 2010s, you can get a good look of spatially how concentrations have gone down. Again, here's the data graphically, and you can see here how the average concentrations have decreased over time. Moving on to dieldrin. Again, looking at it graphically, it's so small on my screen, it's hard to talk about it. So a handful of sites that were 1 meal per month back in the 1980s. Looks like just 2 in the 90s. And then as time progressed, you could see we didn't have any above the FDA action limit for the last, since 2000, so for the last 20 years. Looking at that graphically, you can kind of see how that trends downward. And then moving on to toxaphene. This one was a little interesting, actually. So in the 1990s, there were none. There was one from 2000 to 2009, and that was a Lake Michigan sample. And then in the most recent data, we actually have more hits than we did historically. So this one is interesting because it seems to be trending upward rather than decreasing. The hits we have had were in the Indiana Harbor Canal, Lake Michigan, and Wildcat Creek. The interesting thing about this is all 3 of those sites are already extremely, well, PCBs would drive the advisory regardless. So it's interesting that we didn't get 1 hit, but in 2 different sampling events, we got toxaphene concentrations in the 1 meal per month category. And when I was reaching out to other states to see, I kind of took a poll, and that will come later, but I took a poll on what other states were doing with pesticides, how many states were continuing to sample for organochlorines or have dropped it from their routine monitoring. And I did hear back from Alaska, and they continue to monitor, and they've seen a similar trend with toxaphene. And they actually said they attribute it to, or let's see, so they've seen increasing trends in toxaphene in fish tissue and cord blood, and they think it's due to increased agricultural products from Asia. I don't know what that's necessarily based on, but that was their thought. The other thing with toxaphene that I noticed in our data, at least, was there was just something wonky going on with the older historical data. They were all non-detects, and then starting in 2011, every single sample had a concentration. So I'm not sure if our contract laboratory switched lab methods, or they were able to analyze toxaphene at a lower detection limit. I'm not sure, but there was definitely something wonky with our data. But it's an interesting trend. It doesn't quite fit the mold for all the other organochlorine pesticides. So there you can see how the trends are increasing. And then here's the survey I talked about. I did reach out to a lot of other states just to see what other states were doing. The intent of this analysis was kind of to take it to our upper management to see if we could scale back on analyzing organochlorine pesticides with emerging contaminants and the drive to analyze for PFAS. We need to cut somewhere because our budget doesn't change, but we continue to want to analyze for more and more. So I just wanted to kind of take a survey to take it to management, so they know, we're not starting a trend by dropping pesticides. There are a lot of other states that have already made this decision. So what we're going to do going forward in Indiana is, well, I guess, sorry, jump back to this slide. So most pesticides seem to show that downward trend, and they don't necessarily drive advisories. We don't have any advisories in Indiana based on a pesticide. And with the drive to analyze for PFAS, we think that it may be a good idea to scale back on our pesticide analysis. So what we're going to do going forward, we have kind of a network of what we call core sites, and these are sites that have, I guess the first sites that Indiana started sampling for fish tissue. There's 23 sites across the state, and so since we already have 40 years of pesticide data, we're going to continue to analyze pesticides at these 23 sites in order to continue to look at trends over time. And then through the toxaphene analysis, we did find those 3 locations where there were toxaphene concentrations that would warrant a 1 meal per month advisory. They still won't drive those advisories because those are just happen to be pretty contaminated areas. But we're going to continue to monitor pesticides at those sites. And going forward, our contract lab will still be able to monitor pesticides if for some reason we need to start monitoring it on a regular basis. We'll still have the ability to do that at the drop of a hat. And I think going forward, we're gonna look into expanding our pesticide list, maybe no longer focusing on those organochlorine pesticides, but some of the newer pesticides that are that other states are starting to look at. We'll at least gain the capacity to do that. And that is all I have. And for some reason, I cannot unshare my screen. So New York, I think when you share your screen, you'll trump my presentation.
Okay, I'll try to share. Can folks see my screen? Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I guess we're actually right on schedule now. So for New York State, I think we have I have a brief update. The names that you see on the screen are the team members that contribute to the fish advisory in New York State. Not everyone is full-time, and some are grant funded, and actually no state positions are specifically designated for the fish advisory program, and we also have a part-time contractor. So it's a mix of folks contributing to the program, and overall a great team. For this year, I think I'm going to focus on one update in particular, the last bullet, 18 Mile Creek, but I did want to mention that for several years we were behind in our data reviews. It took a long time to go through our process, and we rarely could keep up with the stream of data that we get from the Department of Environmental Conservation on fish. So we've gradually caught up through changing our process a little bit and having various staff that I mentioned contribute to the process. Also, a major update this year has to do with our work on mercury. We're reevaluating our approach to mercury advisories in New York State, and we were funded with a GLRI grant to do this over 2 years. And we've started that process, and I'll give an update on that at a future consortium meeting. But for today, I'm going to focus on 18 Mile Creek, which is a Lake Ontario tributary. It's contaminated with PCBs, and specifically, I'm going to talk about the salmonid species in that creek. The creek runs, you can see in the insert in the upper right-hand corner of this slide that the creek runs I'm sorry, that the creek is in the west side of the state, flowing into Lake Ontario, flowing south to north, and the PCB source is predominantly in the upstream portion of the creek. And downstream toward Lake Ontario is a dam, which is an impassable barrier to fish. There's a Superfund site there up in the upstream portion, actually most of it, most of the creek, and also the lower portion below Burt Dam is considered an area of a Great Lakes area of concern. However, it's a very popular fishing location. This is a photo of showing folks lining up to fish downstream of the Burt Dam, which is the dam I pointed out in the previous slide. A lot of salmonids spawn in this creek and come in from the lake, and DEC stocks salmonids here. It's very popular. However, we have a do not eat fish advisory because of the PCB source upstream and historical data that showed elevated levels of PCBs in the fish. And also previously, up until last year, we had an approach that if any species had elevated levels of a contaminant, we told women and children, the sensitive population, not to eat any fish of any species. However, to try to accommodate some of the interests in this water body, clearly the mixed messaging between the agencies, DEC stocking fish and DOH saying don't eat fish, and also the desire of EPA and the New York State Great Lakes program to work toward removing the AOC, we asked DEC to collect salmonids from the downstream portion of 18 Mile Creek to help us evaluate those advisories in particular. And the reason, well, I should say the reason we did that is because the salmonids spend a good portion, as many of you know, I'm sure, of their life in the lake and only a small portion in the streams. So the stream is more contaminated, or the creek is more contaminated than the lake. And so we thought that perhaps the salmonids would have lower levels of contaminants. And I didn't bring in a lot of data into this presentation. So just as an example, some PCB levels in brown trout that were collected in 18 Mile Creek below Burt Dam showed basically a higher PCB concentration on average than those collected in Lake Ontario. And you can, although not very high by New York standards, 0.5 versus 0.3 about ppm, we did a statistical comparison, and we did find a statistically significant difference between 18 Mile Creek brown trout and Lake Ontario brown trout. And similarly, rainbow trout or steelhead from 18 Mile Creek were significantly higher than a comparable tributary to Lake Ontario, the Salmon River Hatchery. So, and we saw no difference, however, in Chinook salmon, perhaps because they spend less time in the creek, and the coho salmon, depending on which data we looked at, we had somewhat mixed results. And we did do various other analyses I'm not showing here in terms of comparing statistically. In this slide, I'm showing length standardized PCB concentration differences. We also looked at it just wet weight without standardizing, and the results were pretty similar. So basically, the salmonids were higher, or several of them, at least the rainbow trout and brown trout, clearly were higher in the creek than in the lake. However, we have new PCB guidelines as of 2020, which are very similar to the Consortium PCB guidelines. And those guidelines, they do something different than what we've done in the past, and that is, in the past, we always told women and kids not to eat fish of any species if any single species required restrictive advice. So we have new guidelines now that allow us to, if data are robust enough, we can issue advice. We can allow women and kids to eat fish, even if another species is contaminated. So we applied these new guidelines to the 18 Mile Creek data, and also previously we considered the entire 18 Mile Creek as one water body, and now we divided it up into two water bodies, one being upstream of the dam and one being downstream. So upstream of the dam, the data that we have, which are mostly historical, but are still very high in PCBs, and that's primarily what we call the resident fish. And downstream of the dam, the resident fish, like the bluegills and other species which don't move to a great extent, are still pretty contaminated. And so the result of our comparison to the guidelines is that the don't eat advice still remains upstream of the dam and for the resident species downstream of the dam. But for the salmonids, when we apply the guidelines, we can actually allow women and kids now to eat these fish, the brown trout, chinook, and coho, and rainbow trout. And the asterisk here, the red asterisk, indicates that the advice is still more restrictive than that for Lake Ontario. So from a AOC point of view, beneficial use impairment point of view, the advice is still more restrictive for those categories for which we see the red asterisks. But for the sensitive population, the advice for those species is the same as Lake Ontario. So we're making progress, I think, in working toward AOC removal at some point, but still a lot of work needs to be done to reduce the contaminant levels in the fish. So I just wanted to share, I think the reason that we focused on this is because maybe other states have similar issues with contaminated tributaries to the Great Lakes and how to handle them in light of their AOC programs, and also perhaps other states stock fish at the mouths of these contaminated creeks. So I'd be interested to hear more about that if folks have questions, comments during the comment period. And I've lost track of where we are with time, but I think that's all I have. Yep.
Yep, we're still right on track with time.
Great.
So now we'll open it up to any questions or comments people had. I don't see.
I have to unshare here.
I don't think I see any questions in the chat.
I have a comment on Indiana's presentation. So thank you for sharing information on your pesticide monitoring, what you are finding, especially long-term trends and all that. I want to highlight that we did similar kind of analysis a few years ago and realized that pesticides were not regularly being detected. They were taking a fair bit of our resources. So we progressed towards removing the regular monitoring. And just for everyone's benefit here, on the call today, want to draw your attention to this particular spreadsheet that we have available on our SharePoint. So this spreadsheet was first put together, I believe, in 2015 or 2016. And the intent was actually to conduct that kind of survey among our member states here, in terms of what we are monitoring and what we are planning in terms of moving forward. So what you are seeing on top are different jurisdictions, and then in the first column, different chemical classes, and the color codes are defined here. So whether we are currently monitoring and plan to continue, or we will be discontinuing, and so on. So if you get a chance, please update this spreadsheet so that we are kind of up to date on that. And this same file has different spreadsheets for the benchmarks we use. So there's one for PCB, one for mercury, one for PFOS or PFAS in general, and also some of the advisory parameters that we use. So all those major parameters and the values we use. So again, this gives us opportunity to compare among our sets and modify as necessary. So just wanted to use this opportunity. Thank you again for your update. That's very helpful. Oh, and by the way, regarding your toxaphene trend, which is quite interesting, and would like to learn.
You got cut off, Satyendra.
Sorry, I think I lost internet connection. I hope I'm not interrupting everyone if someone started speaking in between. But yeah, I know you already highlighted that there may be some changes by the contract lab, and so yeah, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
You keep cutting in and out. Now we don't hear you. Could you try?
Thanks. Okay. So yeah, so we have noticed that there may be some interferences from other PCB congeners or other organochlorine pesticides. Sometimes artificially showing toxaphene. So depending on the method that's being used, we used to analyze toxaphene as a total toxaphene. We have now switched to some indicator toxaphene parlors or congeners. But yeah, like that's quite interesting that you are seeing increasing trend. So we'll keep that our eyes on that too. Again, thanks for that information.
Hi, this is Wayne. Comment on, I guess, the pesticides. We actually have places where advisories are driven by the legacy pesticides. We've got a couple of DDT locations throughout the site, and then on Long Island, there was this big issue years ago. I don't really know the details about using chlordane for termites, and so we actually have quite a number of chlordane-based advisories on Long Island. And we do our PCBs organics analysis at our lab, and it's a single analysis for the PCBs and the organochlorine pesticides. So I suspect for the foreseeable future we're going to keep at that, doing those. And also we have a Myrex issue in Lake Ontario, though that does seem to be diminishing because of use in the industrial Niagara River corridor.
Oh, Wayne, this is Tony 40. I just had a kind of question for you. Something that's kind of interesting about DDT, I think we are seeing a fair amount of DDT, not enough to meet the FDA standard, but in old lake trout. Is that due to the age of the fish, that this is stuff that there's their high lipid content, or is it just that they acquired these DDT like a long time ago? It's a really old fish. Do you know the answer to that?
I do not. Yeah, I don't know that.
Okay, well, I just thought brought up. Thanks.
But I mean, there were some release sites. I think there's a. So I mean, we do have some release sites.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Satyendra from Ontario again. So regarding pesticides, typically we do not have, that many inland locations where we would be seeing them at elevated numbers. So generally it has been, kind of within the Great Lakes environment. So our long-term monitoring for the Great Lakes have shown dramatic declines in most of these. And we have published papers on Myrex, toxaphene, chlordane, I believe DDT as well. So some of those have been published, and if you can't look at those papers, please let me know and I can provide.
Thanks.
I'm definitely interested in those papers. Are they on the SharePoint site already, or could you post them on the SharePoint site?
I think they are on SharePoint, but if not, I'll post them. Thanks.
And Satyendra, have you published that cyanotoxins on SharePoint yet?
Actually, that hasn't been published yet. I think a draft is ready to go. We were modifying a few aspects because that was for Lake St. Clair. So we are including some water, like concurrent water monitoring data and some satellite images just to get a sense of what were the conditions around the time when we collected the samples. So it's not published yet, but hopefully soon, and I'll definitely share a copy on SharePoint once available.
Satyendra, what method was used for the microcystin?
A good question. Actually, I was going to make a comment on your analysis too. So we did MMPB1, the one that you are using for total microcystin, and LCMSMS. So yeah, so I think that should be comparable for us. I know you are also analyzing samples. I believe I'm speaking to Ohio folks. So you're going to analyze for individual congener, which is fantastic because then we can do some comparison in a sense that, you know, what's the contribution of, let's say, you know, microcystin LR to total microcystin we are observing. So it's something really interesting, and I guess I would also like to have, you know, discussion with Ohio folks. I know you have drafted some of your guidelines for microcystins. I think it starts at 25 or 15, I believe. So anyways, there are certain things that we can discuss because you folks have done some wonderful stuff on microcystins.
Yeah, sure thing. And then, yeah, once we would analyze the individual containers once we have a detect for total MMPB. We have some preliminary results for the water sample from Grand Lake St. Mary's, but we are waiting for the sample results from other, the fish and water from Lake Erie as well.
I had a question for Ohio. You talked about the development of wallet cards. I was just wondering what information you put on your wallet cards. Is it commercial advice or is it sport fish advice?
These are all sports fish advice actually, are not the commercial ones. So we provide like what fish are safe, and if there is any do not eat advisory listed, so we put that one and links to our FCA booklets and things like that.
Want to comment on your you know, excellent communication effort, especially like so many different products like flyers, wallet cards, and so on, and you are able to print them and provide to various distributors, because I know, like, you know, that there is a kind of a big appetite now to go away from paper and printing and all that, but I know those are also necessary specifically for our purpose. So congratulations on getting that kind of job done.
Thank you.
And I have a specific question about that. You mentioned, I think, 26,000 brochures to a large number of your DNR offices. So our fish consumption materials have gone to our environmental conservation regional offices. I was just wondering, do you have any sense of the uptake out of your DNR offices?
This is Ann. That's a really good question. So this past year was kind of difficult because I don't think a lot of, like, we sent them out, but there wasn't a lot of traffic through them, right? And so the year that we did kind of look at distribution, I think that was 2019. I think it was just kind of in general, whoever we sent stuff out to, they put out most of it, is kind of what I remember as a general overview. But specifically with ODNR, I'm not entirely sure. So the libraries was really a great place. The library said that they put out 100% of their stuff. And that was again in 2019. And so what we did with our, sorry, go ahead.
No, and the local health districts, like almost 62,000 brochures to the LHDs.
Yeah. What we've also done is kind of, instead of putting the year on it really big, since a lot of the information we've put in these are not changing from year to year, we just kind of have it published as of a date. And so we're able to kind of reuse materials from one year to the next if nothing really changes.
Thanks.
Just want to add to the previous discussion on that total microcystin method. So Marilla, we use MMPB LC-MSMS method, but we actually first improved the regular MMPB method. And that new updated method has been published as well, just in case if it helps.
Sure. Oh, okay.
So I just want to say I'm really glad to hear about the microsystems that a couple of you are doing this, because it's not something I know very much about, and don't even have a good handle on what we should be doing for looking in New York. And so it's just really good to hear. And again, this is a good opportunity for us to share information. And some of the states and Ontario are leading on this, and we can benefit from that. So just thanks for sharing that.
Does anyone else have anything to add, comment?
This is Henry. I just was curious if others had any experience with the situation like I had pointed out with 18 Mile Creek, where the salmonids spend most of their time in the lake, but they're still more contaminated in the tributary. And also, as a second question, does anyone have don't eat advisories on for species that are stocked?
Henry, that's a good question. So we, of course, have a number of AOCs on our side of the border, and as I mentioned, we are working on assessing this particular beneficial use impairment. We published a paper, I think, in 2018 on a 3-tier framework to assess the BUI, and one of the questions we encounter is this type of consideration, the migration of species. So people would argue that, like say for Toronto Harbor, that's an area of concern, and big fish like salmonids, they would be going in and out. And when we try to use some of that data, some people would argue, well, that fish is migrating and it could have swum throughout the lake. So how can we really use this information? Now, what I have tried to highlight is, look, we have collected salmonids from different parts of the lake. There are some special differences. So if we caught, one particular sample of Chinook salmon, let's say from Toronto waterfront, we are 100% sure that that fish has spent some time at least in the harbor and have been influenced by the local contamination level, compared to other fish that would have been collected from other parts, may not have spent time in Toronto Harbor. So if we are seeing some special differences in these highly mobile fish, depending on the amount of time they would have spent at different locations, we would see differences. So it is always a challenging topic to communicate and properly actually use in analysis. So we have done that way. The major reason is, these are also popular species for consumption. So we can't totally neglect them from BUI assessment, because if we are focusing only on, local species like yellow perch and, bluegills and so on, of course, their levels would be relatively low because they are small fish, in general. And some species are of interest for consumption like yellow perch, but not everything, right? So we need to encounter both. And we do see, in stockfish, so we are currently stocking walleye in Hamilton Harbor and Toronto Harbor, both AOCs, and we are seeing elevated levels, as they are now growing in size, we are seeing elevated levels, and we are issuing, more stringent advisories, but that's the nature of the beast, I guess.
Interesting. Thanks, Satyendra. Yeah, for our BUI evaluations, the criteria we're using is if the tributary or the AOC has has the same advice as the lake, then the BUI can be considered for removal. So it doesn't have to be that the concentrations have to be the same as the lake, but the advice has to be the same. So it's an interesting scenario where you could have elevated concentrations, but if the advice is still the same, there's potential to remove the BUI.
Yeah, in the 3-tier framework that I was mentioning, like, the first tier is just looking at the advice itself for the OC. If it is meeting the needs of the people, then you could delist. If it doesn't, then in the second tier, we compare advisories with other reference locations. And so as you said, like, levels could be higher, but advice could be the same. Then it could be, and in the third tier, we do detailed analysis where we compare the levels and many other things, including like even sediment levels, young of the year fish, their trend, and so on. So it's a way more complicated in third tier. But yeah, you are right. Like that's why we have kept that advisory comparison on top, because if it meets, then you could delist. That's a good one.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have experience with that issue? Okay.
Well, it seems like we're still a little ahead of schedule. Do we want to take a little longer break, or do we want to just take our 10-minute break and maybe we'll end the meeting a little early?
Ali, I got a couple other questions. I didn't want to.
Sorry.
Just giving other folks a chance. One for Sachendra that you just kind of touched upon. So your approach to the lakes is much more granular than ours, where you divide up into zones, whereas for New York, we pretty much, we have some distinction between Western and Eastern Lake Ontario, so I'm just wondering how much difference generally do you see among your zones within a lake, and I'm just going to ask a totally off the wall piece of this, which is the Lake Ontario circulation is generally sort of counterclockwise, and would that affect potentially the granularity on the north and south shores?
Very good question, Wayne. Actually, you are stealing my thunder for the future meetings. No, you are absolutely right. So we used to see some dramatic differences in the past when levels were quite elevated, like few thousands of nanogram per gram. Now the levels have declined to only few hundreds of nanograms per gram. So we are seeing, relatively low differences in the advisories. Our, Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, they are conducting some telemetric studies on fish movement, and collected some data which shows that some of these big salmonid species are actually moving throughout the lake on both sides of the border. So we are now utilizing this additional information and working towards merging some of those granule regions for specifically larger bodied fish, that are moving throughout the lake. So we may see some consistent advisories in, let's say, not in 2022 update, but down the road, maybe one update after that, like we may still have those regions, local regions, but the advisories would be, more, or I should say advisories would be different for smaller fish where we are seeing real differences in the contaminant levels, but not for large salmonid species. We will try to kind of, standardize them for all their movement areas.
Yeah, because that's useful, because the flip side question for us is, should we be being more granular in our approach to Lake Ontario? So yeah, good. It's good to hear that.
Yeah, and actually, Wayne, we did have separate advice for the Western Basin for white perch for PCBs, but for years you weren't able to get any white perch from that area. So eventually we used, I think, surrogate data for other species, but eliminated that difference between the Western Basin and the rest of the lake. So now we have just one one set of advice for the whole lake.
Actually,
Yeah,
that was due to dioxin, by the way, not PCBs.
Oh, all right. Thanks, Tony, for that.
Yeah, and I know we do some sort of loosely differentiated eastern and western basins, but Ontario is quite a bit more granular than that and specific about it. So that's kind of why I asked. And then I have a question or a comment and a question for Allie. The comment is, I mean, I really liked your historical presentation on the legacy organochlorine pesticides. And the question was, your map, the map of your core sites at the end emphasized the rivers and streams. And if I look, and I don't know if that represents a difference in physiography or where your emphasis on collection is, or just what you just chose to put on the map, because most of our collections, inland collections, are in ponded and not flowing water. So I was just wondering what that difference in what I see on that map versus what we do, what does that reflect?
So that set of sites was our initial sampling program when it first started in the early 1980s or late 1970s. And it did include, you couldn't see it on there, but our site where our DNR office is along Trail Creek, but that's where they actually collect the salmonids. So that does represent Lake Michigan samples as well. But you're right, all the other 22 sites are all the major rivers and streams. And back when they developed the sampling network, a lot of the sites seem to be upstream and downstream of larger urban areas along main stem streams in Indiana. And I selected those kind of to, I guess, to keep the original sampling network going, because those sites will have the longest trend data. Over the years, our sampling network has increased, and we rotate around the state and sample smaller tributaries and lakes and DNR properties and things like that. But I selected those sites to continue to build upon the 40 years of data that we already have.
Okay, thanks. So that's it for my questions.
Does anyone else have any comments? Why don't we go ahead and take a break and meet back at 11. And next on the agenda will be our update from EPA.
Okay, thanks.
Satyendra, are you back yet? All right, should we go ahead and resume? Is everyone back?
Sounds good to me.
All right. So Derek, you can take it away. I'm not sure if you have a presentation to share or.
Yeah, just a really short presentation. You know, since I'm new, I don't have a lot of updates, but I thought I'd take the time to introduce myself. So I am going to share. So can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yes,
Yes.
we can see it.
All right, I'll turn on my video real quick to introduce myself. So hello everyone. My name's Derek Ager, and I work for the Great Lakes National Program Office, and I will be taking over for Jackie. I want to start off by just giving my condolences to everyone. You know, it was definitely a huge shock to us here at Glenpoe. We're still trying to kind of wrap our brains around it. You know, Jackie was a very passionate and knowledgeable person. You know, I was lucky to have the opportunity to work with her and collaborate with her on a few different things, and you know, she will definitely be greatly missed. And I'll talk a little bit how I've worked with Jackie in the past, and how I'll some of my background will help me with taking over the role. So with that, I will save some bandwidth here and turn off my camera. All right. So I feel like I recognized a few of the names on the list. So for those who don't know me yet, my name is Derek Ager. I've been with Glenpoe roughly 6 years now. I work in the Science and Monitoring, Evaluation and Reporting section. So that's a section within Glenpo that handles most, if not all, the Glenpo-based monitoring programs, as well as part of the GLRI planning and budgeting. I have some background in public health, which hopefully will help me in this new role. I have my MPH from the University of Michigan, born and raised in the Ann Arbor area, so well aware of the Great Lakes and Great Lakes issues. My primary roles in Glenpo are the program manager for the Integrated Atmospheric Deposition Network, as well as the GLRI focus area subleads for focus area 1.2, 1.3, and 5.2. And some of this information, this might not be new information for a lot of you, but I just wanted to go over some of the things we do at Glenpo. So outside of the GLRI, I know GLRI gets a lot of the headlines around the Great Lakes area. We do actually have some long-term monitoring programs within Glenpo. We have one of the longest running biology monitoring programs in the country, as well as a limnology and dissolved oxygen program that some in the Lake Erie community might be aware of. But we also do contaminant monitoring, and of our monitoring programs, we have the Great Lakes Fish Monitoring and Surveillance Program and the Great Lakes Sediment Surveillance Program, which are both run by Brian Linnell in Glenpo. Previously, Beth Murphy, who I'm sure you guys have heard of and know, she's on to bigger and better things. But we have Brian taking over for Beth for the fish monitoring and the sediment programs, which are two of the programs that are probably most closely related to your work. And I recently, a couple of years ago, took over the Integrated Atmospheric Deposition Network, which is a program that measures air, so the particulate and vapor, as well as precipitation deposition into the Great Lakes area. We look at obviously the usual suspects, the PAHs, PCBs, pesticides, but we're also starting to look at some new things like HBCD, as well as PFAS. Another thing that Glenpo has been kind of doing in the last couple of years, or I should say last 10 years, is we have a chemical of emerging, I think that's chemical of mutual concern. We have a chemical of emerging concern and chemical of mutual concern surveillance program. So this is run out of focus area 1.3, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second. But we've spent the last decade or so surveilling and researching the bioeffects of hundreds and hundreds of chemicals of emerging concern in the Great Lakes region. So for those who are not familiar with GLRI, there are 5 focus areas. Focus area 1 involves the toxic substance focus area. Focus area 2, invasive species. 3 is the nutrient runoff issues, mainly focusing on Erie and starting to look more at Ontario. Focus area 4 is the habitat and species, so all about habitat restoration and preserving native species. Focus area 5 is the Foundations for Future Restoration, where a lot of our education work is funded, as well as supporting science work. And so I am the sub-lead for the 1.2, 1.3, and 5.2 sub-focus areas. 5.2 work, some of the work that we do under that program involves HAB monitoring and assessment, We're starting to look more into the drivers of HAB toxicity. We look at under that kind of umbrella of that subfocus area, we look at cladophora assessment. And another big thing we do under that is understanding the changing coastal areas. So we develop maps and models and tools to help stakeholders predict the changes that are coming to the different coastal areas, which has been a huge issue in the Great Lakes over the last several years with the high waters. Under Focus Area 1, 1.3 is, as I mentioned, was the chemicals of emerging concern / chemicals of mutual concern focus area. Over the last 10 years, we've been working with a group of federal agencies to better understand the extent and impacts of chemicals of emerging concern. As we moved into Action Plan 3 a few years ago, we've shifted our focus to chemicals of mutual concern, which are chemicals designated binationally as chemicals that are impacting the Great Lakes as a whole, and it's established under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement under Annex 3. And the one that you guys are most familiar with is 1.2, Focus Area 1.2, and that is where we fund our human health and fish and wildlife consumption advisory work. Okay. So I guess just an update, and I guess just kind of, a few comments. Please bear with me. I'm definitely new to this. I do have some background in public health, and I have, as the Focus Area 1.3 lead, I, worked alongside Jackie and, had many conversations with her about the great work you guys do. But I have not been fully immersed in this yet. So bear with me, but we do plan to continue our great work with the states and other partners on fish and wildlife consumption issues. We'll definitely continue our participation in the consortium. I know some of you have questions about GLRI and where the budget is. Again, be patient with me. I'm still trying to figure out kind of where Jackie was with some of this stuff. And that kind of brings me to the next point is let's talk. If you could reach out to me and let me know kind of, who has been working with Jackie in the States to start developing kind of a list of folks in the States that have been working with Jackie. And also I'd love to know, get an update on what work you guys have been doing. And if you guys aren't a part of the, budget and planning, I'd still love to talk, love to meet you, get to know some of the issues you guys are dealing with. And we'll go from there. So again, glad to be a part of this. I'm really excited to kind of dive into this new world. And if you guys have any questions for me, just let me know.
Thanks, Derek. I did have one question. This is Allie from Indiana. We're currently managing our very first GLRI grant. And so far, every time we have communication with our EPA project officer, Jackie wanted us to CC her on any communication. Should we CC you in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great.
All right. Well, we look forward to meeting you in the future at some point in time. I think we'll hear about future meetings, future in-person meetings, potentially in one of the upcoming consortium meetings on another Thursday. But up next, we have our discussion topic for the day, and it'll be led by Audrey and Tom Barron. How to communicate differences between fish consumption advisories and water quality standards.
Okay, this is Tom Barron. Unfortunately, I do not, well, maybe it is fortunate. I don't have a camera, so you won't be seeing me. There is a little vignette there of what I used to look like back when I was younger. So we're going to give a brief introduction. Audrey and I will give you some discussion on fish consumption advisory and water quality standards development, and then some communication questions, and then we're going to open it up for a group conversation and discussion here. So bear with us. I'll share my screen here to get started with the introduction on development of fish consumption advisories and standards. But I did have a question for everybody out there. I think I know most of you, but in your life and working on these topics, fish consumption advisories and/or water quality standards, how many of you do have roles in both worlds? I do. I'm the chair of the Pennsylvania Technical Work Group, and I also do water quality standards as my primary job. So I saw one hand pop up there. So
yeah, this is Mariah from Ohio EPA. We do standards and fish consumption work. So yeah.
Yeah, we're a limited group because most of the time when we're talking with folks, most people are focused on one or the other. And I'm going to share a little bit about. I see, Santander, you also are in both there. So I'm going to share my perspectives. Now, this is not the position of Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection in any way. This is my perceptions on how these things play out. But yeah, it's usually something that's in the health departments or in the resource management agencies. But here in Pennsylvania, we have a shared responsibility with the interagency work group that deals with the health part of it, the fish resources, the agriculture for food safety and aquaculture, and then environmental protection for the other components. So it's unusual, I think, for this to be kind of managed by the standards people, but we are an interagency group, so we get all aspects of it in our discussions and in our work. So let me share my screen, and we'll get started. So see if I can launch the screens here. There we go. Can everybody see the introductory slide here?
Looks good.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about communicating the differences between fish consumption advisories and water quality standards. Audrey and I will give an introduction, and then we'll have the group discussion. So first, we're going to try to cover some of the, and this is going to be a very high level overview of it, so we're not going to get down into the weeds. But if you want to, I would be interested in hearing from you or discussing this and possibly continuing this discussion further. But why are there differences? What are some of the differences that we see? The big question is, does it matter that there are differences? And then finally, how do we communicate those differences and kind of allay some of the confusion that possibly is out there for the people that are seeing those differences. So we'll start off that both fish consumption advisories and water quality standards, as you know, are intended to protect human health. But why are there differences? Well, the main reason is we use the same basic scientific information or assumptions, but we don't always use them in the same way, and we don't apply them the same way. There are some fundamental differences in how the fish consumption advisories or the water quality standards are developed, and not only by how they're developed, but how they are used or implemented as well. So, water quality standards, as we've often heard, are generally regulatory and have an associated measure of mandate and enforceability. So there's a regulation behind it or a requirement behind it. Whereas fish consumption advisories are generally guidances and recommendations. They're not regulatory, they're not mandated or not enforceable. So they're, again, recommendations. So fish consumption advisories and water quality standards are generally calculated using different risk assumptions and factors. The equations are different. The processes are different on how they are developed. From my perspective, again, this is my perspective, and I would like to hear from you in our group discussion what you think about this, why there could be other differences. But water quality standards are generally developed assuming the worst case scenario. We're attempting to prevent any exposure to pollutants in harmful amounts. And it's, again, by design, the worst case scenarios. Whereas fish consumption advisories, and this is a big challenge for us, but in contrast, we're trying to balance the health benefits of consuming fish while also limiting the potential health risk or exposures to those possible pollutants. So again, it's a balancing act that creates some of those differences with fish consumption advisories. One of the things that I see comes down to if the fish consumption advisory or the water quality standard is based on a cancer risk, some of the risk factors are different. The assumptions are different. The equations are certainly different. And one of the big changes that we have between programs, even within the water quality protection programs, like drinking water, surface water, but between those water programs and fish consumption advisories, EPA allows the risk to range from 1 to -4 to 1, or 10 to -4 to 10 to -6. So we have a fairly wide range of risk assumption there that it's still valid, but it can result in significantly different recommendations or guidelines and or criteria in the end. One of the big differences we have from standards, water quality standards to fish consumption advisories is that in water quality standards, we can also consider the additional exposures to other sources of the pollutant. And it's not just where in fish consumption advisory, we're considering the consumption of the fish is the main source. But in water quality standards, we can consider the consumption of the water and the organism, and then other relative source contributions and other components of our life and lifestyles that would cause additional exposures. So that, again, is building in that additional worst case scenario, additional safety factors that go into water quality standards that are not always considered in the fish consumption advisory realm as much. So we, and again, I'm not going to get into the weeds, but we can point to these resources as how we generally develop and calculate fish consumption advisories and or water quality standards. So there's specific guidelines and guidance from EPA for both of these operations and activities. So I just wanted to offer up these. These are the resources that we typically turn to. Now, we also have other resources, and what I probably should have put in here was the Great Lakes Consortium. I don't know if you guys know that group, but they have a pretty good resource as well and some good guidance. So I should have put them on this slide, shouldn't I? Sorry. But we do use these guidelines in developing our best practices and our methods that we use in the Great Lakes, as you all know. All right. So, other than making it difficult, and we've experienced this and we discussed it in our meetings other times, difficult to understand, to explain, but does it really matter if there are these differences? There's, like I was pointing out, there are good reasons to have the differences, since the goals and objectives of the two programs are different. Again, worst case scenario versus the trying to create that balance between the beneficial health effects and limiting the potential harmful exposures in fish consumption. So I think this is pretty much where, unless you had questions about any of this, setting up that there are differences, we'll jump in and let Audrey take over with discussing some of the communication issues that she's experienced and we want to talk about then. So Audrey, did you want to just, I can continue sharing my slides, my screen, and
you know, unsurprisingly, I added 2 slides.
Oh, okay. If you want to share yours.
It's just photos, though. It's essentially resources that I remembered that New York had that I should probably at least, you know, show. Just let me, let's see. Okay. You guys see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Great.
Well, that might be because I just clicked on something. let me back out here.
I'm trying to do slideshow. Okay, there we go. So EPA also has this guide for assessing chemical contaminant data for use in fish advisories, focuses on risk communication. So that's another resource that Tom had put in here as well. So, you know, this is kind of going more towards the lay audience side of things and sort of some of the communication issues that I've noticed come up repeatedly when we're out talking to anglers. Can you guys see slide 10?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the first one is fish advisory contaminants versus drinking water. Those fish contaminants again versus swimming in a water body. Issues and questions around bacteria, CSOs, fishing, eating the fish, and then, you know, as essentially harmful algal blooms become kind of more common, they're happening in newer water bodies, you know, that haven't previously experienced them. We're getting more questions about what to do if you see them, whether people should be recreating near them, fishing, eating the fish. So just very briefly, I'll touch on all of these topics. So there are fish advisories for my public drinking water source. Is my drinking water safe? So this actually comes up a fair bit in the Hudson Valley, where we work a lot, because a lot of our reservoirs have fish advisories for them in regards to mercury. And a lot of these reservoirs are actually like feeding the New York City public water system. And so what we try to tell people and to help them understand is that fish can have many thousands of times and sometimes even millions of times the level of chemicals compared to the water. And essentially we just try to give them confidence that, you know, the public water systems in New York State are very closely monitored for contaminants. Finished water must be below our MCL levels, and then we always can refer them to our Bureau of Water Supply if they have more questions. But this is like a very, very common question that we get. People, you know, the bioaccumulation, the biomagnification, it's kind of hard for people to understand that the water is safe even if there's chemicals in the fish. Is it safe to swim in water with a fish advisory? So especially on the Hudson River, we get this question a lot. This is a photo of my son in the Hudson at Kingston Point Beach, covered in Hudson River mud. Again, fish can have thousands of times the chemicals as the water. And, you know, chemicals usually aren't the issue in the water. And I'll say this with, except in rare circumstances where you might be, you know, around a remediation site. And usually in that case, the sediments are more concerned. So there are areas in the upper Hudson near where the factories were that, you know, really discharged a lot of the PCBs in this case, where there's caps that have been put into place. There's notice signs or there's fences that keep people out of the sediments. But for the most part, that's usually not an issue. However, we always recommend that the public swims at regulated bathing beaches because they're monitored for water safety and for contaminants. And Callum thought that, you know, this day was very fun, covering himself in Hudson mud. And, you know, bacteria is often more of the concern when swimming in water bodies, especially when swimming at non-regulated bathing beaches. Because the beaches are regularly monitored, you know, there's alerts and there's closures if things come back high. Many of our waters, though, in New York State, and I'm sure in many of the other Great Lakes states, we're surrounded by antiquated infrastructure, whether it's CSOs, combined sewer overflows, that are happening in the city, you know, and they're permitted for the most part, or malfunctioning septic systems. Both of those infrastructure issues affect both urban and rural areas. And we really can't underestimate the natural sources too. I mean, how many times have you showed up at a park and it's like, you know, 75 geese just hanging out right by the water? So the concern from eating the fish from these waters is more angler contact with the water, right? The fish don't mind that there's a CSO happening for the most part, unless there's like a dissolved oxygen issue. But, you know, typically we cook our fish. You know, people always laugh when I'm like, well, do you like Hudson sushi or do you like, you know, a nice grilled fillet? Ultimately, people always choose the grilled fillet. I don't understand why. You know, it's I use the example of chicken quite a bit when we're out with people, and then it kind of like helps them understand that it's like there can be things on raw meat. Like that's why we say wash your hands after handling raw meat, you know, but you cook it and it's okay. So really the issue is angler contact with the water. And with both swimmers and anglers, you know, using common sense measures to limit exposure is kind of the way to go. You know, avoid touching your face and mouth after you've just touched the water or the fish. Wash your hands before eating. Shower after contact when you get home. You know, if you're swimming, try not to submerge your face, or definitely not, you know, drink the water. Just use common sense and use your senses. Like if you get to a water that you're going to fish in and it smells like poop, there's probably poop. You know, if you get to that swimming beach and there's like 10,000 geese, maybe another day is a better choice. So in 2018, we actually released our good sanitary practices while fishing and handling fish tip sheet for anglers. We had simplified some of our previous language, and it's a 2-page little tip sheet. And it's actually quite popular. We get a lot of orders for this one, and it's one of those things that it's, you know, it's helpful to just reinforce with folks that, you know, just common sense measures can make a big difference. And we're actually eventually we'll probably put out a companion piece to this one about swimming, again, because not everybody has access, first of all, to a regulated bathing beach. Like on the Hudson, for example, there's essentially, I think, 3 in like over 200 miles. So that's obviously not going to work for everyone. And in that, we'll just highlight those kind of simple common sense measures you can take to make sure you're staying, healthy. And then harmful algal blooms. This is an increasing wild card. The blooms are frequent in New York. It may affect waters that have never previously had issues, so it's a new issue for a community. The public often has several questions regarding fishing and recreating. Our advice is don't swim, fish, boat, or wade in areas with blooms. Don't eat the fish caught from areas with blooms. Rinse with clean water if anyone has contact with it, and keep your pets away from it too. Have a nice brochure that kind of has know it, avoid it, report it. That's page. Well, it's a trifold, so this is one side of it, and then this is the other. But we do get a fair bit of questions, but people, especially for people that have not had their water bodies come up with blooms before, they're kind of like, what do we do now? And well, you have to avoid it while it's there. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Audrey. There was one other thing that I failed to mention at the beginning of the introduction, that we actually did put out onto the SharePoint. Was an actual document that we summarized some of the things that I was discussing. So let me share that to let you know that that is out there for you to review. It gives you some of the, like I said, it was very high level discussion for the presentation and introduction, but I got into a little bit deeper in the summary document that's posted on as a presentation support document. Gives you those live links that you can check out. Here are the actual equations that we use in developing aquatic life criteria, or not aquatic life, ambient water quality criteria and fish consumption advisories. So it kind of lays out the typical equations. Now these are the recommended and typical ones. We do use others, as you know. And then we wanted to get into this group discussion, and this is where we would like to add this group discussion. We'll base it off of what's in the recording and the transcripts of the meeting here, but we'll add all of what we talk about here today to the rest of this summary so that we have it documented and we can reference back to it and add to it as this discussion continues to evolve. EPA did bring it up a little while ago, asking if the states, if they thought the two programs should have similar approaches and use the same numbers and match things a little more and be more consistent across the programs. So it's something that will probably be continuing as a discussion with EPA and between us as well as the states who implement these programs. So I just wanted to point you to that document that is available as a handout for today.
And I will update my portion probably in the next week as well.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
So for the group, I mean, from the technical side or from the outreach side, do other folks sort of, I don't want to say struggle with these issues, or have you encountered similar issues or questions as Tom in Pennsylvania and myself in New York have?
This is Allie from Indiana. I'm not directly involved in developing water quality standards, but we do use our fish tissue data to assess based on some of those water quality standards, the PCBs and the mercury, and I assume in the future selenium. But I've always had a struggle with our PCB, the way we impair based on PCBs, because when I look at the protocol and the concentration used for fish consumption advisories, 20 parts per billion is unrestricted consumption of the fish. Yet when we use our PCB water quality standard to impair a river, stream, or lake, 20 parts per billion is considered impaired. So I've always struggled with the fact that we're impairing all of these rivers and streams, yet you can eat as many fish as you want. And I know I've looked at what some other states use concentration compared to other states. And unfortunately, our kind of our coordinator who uses the water quality standards to impair our rivers and streams just left. But before she left, we were discussing changing the protocol that we use to make it less stringent and maybe adapt the way we impair streams so it matches more with advisory concentrations. But I don't know, I was wondering, I guess, if other states struggle with that, where they, you know, your river is impaired, but you can eat, but your message to the public is you can eat as many fish as you want. It just, for some reason in my head, it just doesn't make sense, and I struggle with that.
Hi, Allie. This is Mariah Hood from Ohio EPA. So I deal with the consumption advisory and then our integrated report. So I have to think a lot about how those two data agree. And I definitely agree with Tom that you have to think about how that there's this risk assessment to impairing a water body due to water quality standards that's thinking about this worst case scenario. But then fish consumption advisories, we're also trying to balance the benefit of fish consumption. The other thing that's helped me understand the difference between the two is that fish consumption advisories are prescriptive in that we say, okay, eat this much fish to stay under this risk level. Whereas whenever we're doing calculations for water quality standards, we're assuming a level of consumption. And those levels of consumption between the consumption advisories and then the water quality standards are not the same. And so we do have water bodies that have consumption advisories but don't have an impairment, but also vice versa, depending on what contaminant it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I guess I feel like the concentration we use, you know, nearly, I would say, like, it's so low that probably 75% of the sites that we sample end up being impaired. And so I feel like that kind of, since we're impairing so much, is it really representing those water bodies in the state that are really have high concentrations? I feel like it just, I don't know, I guess you lose that, you lose the level of detail to, when you're impairing everything, I guess you lose being able to decipher what's really impaired, you know, where there are really PCB concentrations that are concerning. And
I think that's a valid concern for that too, yeah.
And so I guess I was wondering, what do other states use? Ours is 20 parts per billion, and I know some other states use like 200 or 50. And so I just feel like we need to reevaluate how we are doing things.
I just looked up our Ohio's through our integrated report so this is for our water quality standards. And so thinking about our PCB thresholds for the Lake Erie Basin, Our maximum allowable fish concentration is 23 parts per billion. The Ohio River basin is 54 parts per billion. And to compare that, our 1 meal per week advisory is 50 parts per billion, and a 1 meal per month advisory would be 220 parts per billion. Let me screen capture that and put it in the comments as a table so it's easier to read.
Yeah, this is Audrey Rush. I manage the Water Quality Standards Program in Ohio at Ohio EPA. And while Mariah's putting it up on the screen, one of the things, kind of a two basins. You know, we have Lake Erie and Ohio River, and the Ohio River is those inputs are kind of set by Orsenko, and then of course we have high for Lake Erie. So even the inputs to both the consumption and the water quality standards are completely different for those two basins. We don't get a lot of questions from the public on that, but when we do, it's very difficult to explain. So.
Can I, online is your, I guess, integrated report assessment methodology available to see how you got those concentrations or what equation you used to get those?
I'll copy and paste the link in. It's a public facing document, so it's kind of generalized, but it does have some technical detail. And you can always ask me if something's not detailed enough.
This is Anne Gregg. Mariah, correct me if I'm wrong, but the difference also with us in Ohio is that we use a whole body for the integrated report versus just the fillet versus in the fish consumption advisory. And that kind of makes
No, we actually do.
Okay.
Well, we do use fillets for the fish consumption or for the integrated report. We don't use whole bodies for that because we're focused on human health, not environmental in this case.
This is Wayne. I have a question then. And first of all, Tom, I thought that was a really helpful explanation for me. But EPA has a water quality criterion, which is based on mercury in fish tissue. So my first question is, what is the relationship, and they're proposing one for selenium. So what is the relationship between the criterion and the standard? Is that a relevant question, or am I just off base entirely, not understanding something?
Okay, yeah, so step back a little bit. Water quality standards contain a designated or an existing use, a use that's to be protected, and it also includes the criterion that will protect that use. So the standard is a combination of the use that's being protected and the criterion that protect the use. In addition to that, there's a third part, which is the anti-degradation policy to keep things in level of protections. So yeah, they're somewhat interchangeable in that the criteria are subpart of the standard. So when EPA comes out with a standard like the methyl mercury, that would be for the protection of human health. That's the use. The criterion is now tissue-based to protect human during that consumption.
That's really
that make
helpful.
sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that's really helpful. And then the other thing, common question, or at least to bring up, is so the EPA criterion for mercury is 300 parts per billion in fish tissue, and that is frequently used as a sort of a benchmark for whether advice is warranted or whether the fish are safe to eat. And it seems to me that, and maybe you can, and maybe my interpretation is wrong, but it seems to me that using it that way is a little bit of a misinterpretation of what the criterion is for, because it really is directed at the water quality standard, and particularly when you talked about fish consumption advisories set a balance versus the water quality standards are meant to be sort of a worst case. So is using that 300 parts per billion directly as a comparative in talking about risk for fish consumption appropriate?
This is Pat. Do you mind if I jump in?
Oh, go ahead, please.
Thanks. I don't think it's appropriate to use the 300 or 0.3 for a benchmark for fish consumption advice. And I've had conversations with Dave Evers' group, who I think is one of the main promoters for using it that way. I've also talked to other people who have used it. So I think that the more this group can have discussions with others that use the 300 as a benchmark for fish advisories and explain that it's inappropriate will help dispel that inappropriate use of that. But it's always been a confusion since that criterion came out and people interpret it that way.
Yeah, this is Tony. I think that if I recall, that AWQC was based on a specific risk assessment with a certain fish consumption rate, all those other assumptions that they're baked into it. So yeah, if you just take it, it's not really, you take it at face value, you're ignoring, they're ignoring where it came from. I believe that's the case.
Yeah, it does assume certain consumption of both, I think, recreational and commercial fish.
Uh-huh.
One other thing that I would add is that when I was working on fish consumption advice, I felt like part of my job was to try to maintain a separation between the fish consumption advisory and the water quality standards because of their totally different purpose, as Tom explained. The water quality standards are intended to be a level that you want the water to be cleaned up to or not polluted above. So it's cleanup, and for emissions, things like that, it's kind of a lofty goal because it's usually based on very, very stringent criteria versus what you guys have been talking about for the risks and benefits of fish consumption. So in my mind, it's very important to keep good separation between the two. And in Minnesota, as I mentioned in the past, we have that same issue, Allie, as you're seeing with your PCBs, but we have it with PFAS. I mean, any detection of PFAS in fish is going to be an impairment then for that water versus in unrestricted consumption based on the protocol, or I mean the best practice.
Maybe I can add a bit specifically on the PFAS side. So I agree that there are different purposes for the water quality guidelines as well as the fish consumption and all that. Regarding PFAS, though, we are typically dealing with situations where systems have been contaminated for particular reasons, like whether those are firefighting training activities or other direct sources, and there may be potential cleanup activities required to restore the environmental conditions. So if water quality standards are not in sync with fish consumption advisory benchmarks, those remediation actions may not result in fruitful outcomes, because the ultimate goal might be to reduce the levels in fish and remove fish consumption advisories. So just want to highlight one of the papers that we recently published on this particular topic, in which we try to actually bring both of them to the same level. And in this particular paper, we did highlight that, based on the current water quality standards at that time, so this was done a few years ago, paper was published in 2016, so 5 years ago, we could see fish concentrations, that would be like 100 times greater than, do not eat advisory benchmark. And those benchmarks were also higher at that time. So now it could be even worse. But similarly, water quality benchmarks have come down too. So to summarize, I think there needs to be some synchronization in certain situations where the overall goal is to reduce fish consumption advisories.
Well, I'm glad I asked. This really helped clarify things for me. And yeah, so thank you for this discussion. This is really helpful for me.
Oh, I'm glad. And again, we did bring this up earlier on, especially when I believe it was now that selenium is becoming fish tissue or tissue-based, that this is going to be a new direction. It is a new direction that EPA is going with these complex criteria that are not just, these were simple numbers before that represented water column concentrations. Now it's getting more complex, and there is, what is the interpretation of a fish tissue based or a tissue based criterion? What does that mean for the water column criterion or concentration that represents that tissue based concentration? And then this interface between the two programs, how do we use them? And I think it's good to have that separation. People were talking about the integrated report, though, is where often this interface then crosses over. We do the same thing in Pennsylvania. If we have a fish consumption advisory that exceeds our statewide meal advice of 1 meal per week, is our lowest level of the statewide consumption advice. Anything more restrictive than that is considered in the integrated report as an impairment, because under the Clean Water Act, the states are required to protect the waters for fishable and swimmable uses. That's the fundamental uses under the Clean Water Act. And it was clarified that that fishable part is not just that you have a recreational opportunity, but you also are able to consume those fish. It's consumption as well as recreation. So that's what's causing some of this intersect, because of that. These are section 101A. They're the basic fishable, swimmable uses that have to be protected by Clean Water Act regulations. And that fishable part includes both the recreational component, but also the consumption. So many states will use their consumption advisories as an indicator of an impairment if it's restricting the consumption. And then all states, 50 states and how many tribes and territories probably have equally different number of approaches to doing this. But trying to get a handle on that too is really tough. But I appreciate this discussion, and I would like to see this because we are challenged with our programs and our communications of it. If everybody's interested in continuing this, I certainly am, to help us improve our communications across the programs. Because every time we introduce a new water quality criteria, it often comes up that, and especially now that we're getting into these complex water quality standards and criteria. But when we issue our fish advisories and then soon follow up with our integrated reports, it just raises it again. So it's out there, and people are starting to pay attention and seeing sometimes what is perceived as a disconnect. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, this sort of sideline, but we're raising the issue of selenium in fish has been raised. I know out west it can be an issue, but has anybody found a problem with selenium in fish in our waters and here in the Great Lakes states?
In Indiana, we only see the elevated concentrations above the water quality criteria in lakes or downstream of lakes that receive discharge from a power plant or rivers that are highly industrialized. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Grand Calumet River. It's an area of concern up along Lake Michigan, and I think it did not meet all 13 beneficial uses. So they're slowly working on that, but that is one system where we see high selenium, and then there's one reservoir that receives effluent from a power plant that has high selenium. Those are the only places in Indiana that we've found it.
Have you looked at fish? I know it can accumulate in fish to some degree, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's based on the fish concentrations.
Oh, it is. Okay. So do you actually issue any advisories due to selenium then?
We do not.
Okay.
Well, I mean, Grand Calumet rivers already do not eat, so.
Okay. I mean, yeah, just anyway, there is, some risk numbers out there that if you had high enough levels, if you did risk assessment, you might find a problem, obviously, with selenium. But I just was wondering. I know out west it has happened, but yeah, thanks.
Well, this is Audrey again in Ohio. It's my understanding the selenium criterion is an aquatic is an actual protective number to the fish itself.
Yeah, it's fish health, not yeah.
Right. So it's not really based on human health consumption.
Right, but I guess I'm just thinking that if we found elevated selenium levels, we could do risk assessment because I know there's actually, I believe there's an RFD for it, and I'm sorry, there's a cancer potency factor, and I think there probably has to be an RFD. Although, of course, the ironic thing is an essential nutrient helps protect you from mercury toxicity. So it's one of those things. Anyway, you're just curious. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Tom and Audrey. That was a really great discussion, and it sounds like we could go on and on. And I really appreciate the resources you put together. I think that will be very helpful to reference in the future. So that kind of concludes the meeting today. We've run a couple minutes over. Like I said earlier, I can stay on the line and keep teams open if anyone has anything else they wanted to stay on and discuss. Our next meeting is Thursday, December 2nd. And I just wanted, I guess, open it up one more time. Does anyone else have any announcements in closing?
This is Jill. I'm just going to remind everyone to please post your presentations on SharePoint. I think most of today's are up there, but those who are presenting in the next couple meeting days, please do so. And then I'll also let everyone know selenium is on the agenda for the December 9th meeting, I believe. So we will also have a little discussion time then.
Cool. Thanks, Jill.
All
And
right,
thanks
thank you.
for all your work in planning this meeting. Really appreciate it. All right. Well, I'll see you all in a couple weeks. Happy Thanksgiving.
Oh, yes, you too.
Yep.
That's good.
Enjoy.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Hey, Al, you still there?
I am. I was just muted.
I think it went well. Nice job.
Yeah, got through the first one. Yeah. Did you take any notes? I took a few.
I took attendance and then I copied some stuff from the chat.
Okay, very cool.